There's a moment in every economy that almost nobody notices. It doesn't arrive with panic, empty shelves, or collapsing banks. In fact, it often looks like the opposite. Jobs still exist, markets still function, and headlines still talk about resilience and soft landings. To most people, life feels normal. This is precisely why this moment is so dangerous. Economies rarely stop growing in dramatic fashion. They slow quietly, almost politely, hiding behind numbers that look acceptable and narratives that sound reassuring. By the time people agree something is wrong, the real damage has already been done. The illusion begins with stability. After years of expansion, growth starts to lose momentum, not collapse, just weaken. Instead of rapid productivity gains, there's incremental progress. Instead of new industries, there's optimization of old ones. On paper, this doesn't look like failure. Governments point to employment figures. Central banks highlight controlled inflation. Investors focus on asset prices that continue to rise. Stability becomes proof that the system is healthy. But stability can also be a sign that an economy has stopped evolving and started protecting what already exists. What makes this phase especially deceptive is that it feels earned. Past success creates confidence. People believe institutions know what they're doing because they worked before. Policies that once fueled growth are repeated, even when conditions have changed. Risk-taking slowly disappears, replaced by caution disguised as prudence. Innovation gives way to maintenance. Growth doesn't stop because of one bad decision. It slows because the system becomes comfortable with the way things are. This is also the phase where warnings are easiest to ignore. Productivity growth flattens, but it's explained away as a temporary cycle. Wages stop rising meaningfully, but credit fills the gap. Investment shifts from productive activity to assets that feel safer and more predictable. None of this triggers alarms. In fact, many celebrate it as maturity. A developed economy, people say, isn't supposed to grow fast anymore. And that belief becomes the most convenient excuse of all. The illusion of stability works because it doesn't feel like loss. Nothing obvious is taken away. There is no single villain, no sudden shock to point at. Instead, opportunity quietly narrows. The future becomes less dynamic than the past. Growth turns from something created into something managed. And when an economy reaches that point, reversing course becomes far harder than anyone expects. But stability is only the surface. Underneath it, subtle changes are already reshaping incentives, behavior, and priorities. And those changes determine whether stagnation becomes permanent or temporary. That's where the real story begins. If you want more deep dives into how economies drift into trouble without anyone noticing, make sure to subscribe and share this with someone who enjoys understanding how money and power actually work. And if you haven't yet, check out our previous video on long-term economic traps. It connects directly to what comes next. Because once growth quietly peaks, the decisions made immediately after determine whether an economy adapts or slowly locks itself into decline. Economic growth rarely announces its peak. There is no official signal, no headline that says, "This was as good as it gets." Instead, growth fades into something slower and flatter. Often hidden behind averages and carefully chosen comparisons. When an economy reaches this point, most people don't feel poorer. They simply stop feeling better. Living standards plateau. Opportunities feel harder to reach, but not impossible. This ambiguity is why the peak of growth is almost never recognized in real time. At this stage, policymakers often misread what they are seeing. Slower growth is framed as a temporary slowdown caused by external shocks, global cycles, or short-term disruptions. The assumption is that once conditions normalize, growth will return to its previous path. But what's often happening is structural. The easy gains, urbanization, demographic expansion, industrial scaling, or technological catch-up, have already been captured. What remains requires deeper reform, riskier innovation, and political trade-offs that few leaders are eager to make. For businesses and investors, this moment feels deceptively safe. Returns are still available, but they increasingly come from efficiency, consolidation, and financial engineering rather than true expansion. Companies focus on cutting costs, buying up competitors, or optimizing supply chains instead of building something genuinely new. Profits continue, but the engine behind them shifts. Growth becomes something extracted rather than created. This is rarely seen as a problem until it is. Households feel this change differently. Income growth slows, but consumption is maintained through borrowing. Credit steps in to preserve lifestyles that wages alone can no longer support. At first, this feels like progress. Access to loans, mortgages, and financial products is framed as empowerment. In reality, it masks stagnation. Debt quietly replaces income growth, allowing the economy to appear healthy while underlying momentum weakens. What makes this phase especially dangerous is that it rewards the wrong lessons. Because nothing collapses, leaders conclude that their approach is working. Markets reward short-term stability. Voters reward policies that avoid disruption. The political and economic system becomes optimized to preserve calm, not to restart growth. Any proposal that involves short-term pain for long-term gain becomes politically toxic. This is the moment when an economy still has options, but those options are already narrowing. Structural reform, investment in productivity, and long-term innovation are still possible, but they require admitting that the old model has reached its limits. Most systems resist that admission. Instead, they choose delay. And delay, in economics, is rarely neutral. It compounds problems quietly. If this pattern sounds familiar, it's because history repeats it across countries and decades. Growth doesn't end with a crash. It ends with hesitation. If you're finding value in this breakdown, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. And don't miss our previous video on economic illusions. It sets the foundation for what happens next. Because once hesitation replaces adaptation, the first invisible shifts begin, and they change an economy long before any crisis appears. Once growth has quietly peaked, the economy doesn't stall overnight. Instead, subtle shifts begin to take place beneath the surface, changes that are easy to miss because they don't immediately disrupt daily life. These shifts are not dramatic events. They are gradual adjustments in incentives, behavior, and priorities. And because they unfold slowly, they are often mistaken for normal evolution rather than early warning signs. One of the first invisible shifts is in productivity. Output per worker stops improving at the pace it once did. This doesn't mean people are working less or companies are failing. It means the economy is getting less return from each additional unit of effort. New investments yield smaller gains. Innovations feel incremental rather than transformative. Over time, growth relies more on adding inputs, more hours, more debt, more complexity, rather than becoming fundamentally better at producing value. At the same time, capital begins to flow differently. Instead of funding new ideas, new industries, or long-term projects, money increasingly chases assets that already exist. Real estate, financial instruments, and established firms absorb a growing share of investment. These assets feel safer, more predictable, and politically protected. The economy starts rewarding ownership more than creation. This shift is rarely framed as a problem. Rising asset values are often celebrated as signs of prosperity, but they also signal that the system is running out of productive places to grow. Labor markets reflect this change as well. Jobs remain plentiful, but wage growth weakens. Career progression slows. Younger generations find it harder to achieve the same milestones as those before them. To compensate, households rely more on credit and dual incomes. Again, nothing breaks. The system adapts just enough to avoid visible stress, reinforcing the belief that everything is fine. Perhaps the most dangerous shift happens in mindset. Policymakers and institutions grow more reactive than strategic. Instead of shaping the future, they focus on managing risks and preventing disruption. Stability becomes the primary goal. Any change that threatens existing structures, no matter how necessary, feels dangerous. Over time, the economy becomes very good at avoiding short-term pain and very bad at preparing for long-term challenges. These invisible shifts don't trigger crises on their own. They quietly reshape the economy's foundation, making future problems harder to solve and more expensive to ignore. By the time the effects are obvious, the choices that could have prevented them are no longer available. If this kind of deep, behind-the-scenes analysis helps you see the economy more clearly, subscribe and share this video with someone who enjoys understanding long-term trends. And if you missed our earlier discussion on growth plateaus, check it out. It connects directly to what's unfolding here. Because once these shifts take hold, success itself begins to change behavior, and that transformation sets the stage for everything that follows. Long periods of success don't just shape economic outcomes, they reshape behavior. When an economy grows steadily for years or even decades, the habits formed during that expansion become deeply embedded. Institutions learn what works, businesses learn where profits come from, and citizens learn what to expect from the system. Over time, these lessons harden into assumptions. And those assumptions can quietly turn success into a liability. One of the first behavioral changes appears in risk-taking. During high-growth periods, experimentation is rewarded. New industries form, unconventional ideas get funding, and failure is tolerated because the overall system is expanding fast enough to absorb losses. But once growth slows, the tolerance for risk declines. Capital becomes cautious. Investors favor proven models over uncertain innovation. Governments prioritize protecting existing jobs and industries instead of creating conditions for new ones. What once felt dynamic becomes defensive. This shift also affects policymaking. Leaders who rose during good times are often judged by their ability to preserve stability, not to reinvent the system. Policies that worked in the past are repeated, even when the underlying conditions have changed. Because those policies once delivered growth, questioning them feels unnecessary, or even reckless. The political cost of experimentation rises, while the perceived benefit falls. As a result, Reform is delayed until it becomes unavoidable, and by then it is usually more painful. Businesses adapt in similar ways. Rather than investing in long-term productivity, they focus on protecting margins. Cost-cutting replaces innovation. Market dominance replaces competition. Mergers and acquisitions become safer bets than building something new from scratch. This behavior makes sense at the individual level, but collectively it weakens the economy's ability to generate future growth. The system becomes optimized for efficiency, not progress. Public expectations shift as well. Citizens come to view stability as a right and disruption as a threat. Any change that introduces uncertainty, even if it promises long-term benefits, is met with resistance. Social contracts built during growth become harder to sustain when growth slows, but no one wants to be the first to admit that trade-offs are necessary. The result is a quiet stalemate. Everyone wants progress, but no one wants the process required to achieve it. None of this happens because people are irrational or malicious. It happens because success teaches the wrong lessons when it lasts too long. The economy becomes very good at repeating what worked and very bad at adapting to what's next. And while this behavior feels reasonable in the moment, it gradually locks the system into a narrower path, one where flexibility disappears and options shrink. If you're enjoying this deeper look at how economies evolve beneath the surface, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. And be sure to check out our earlier video on invisible economic shifts. It adds important context to what we're uncovering here. Because once behavior adapts to preserve success, easy solutions start to look irresistible. And that's when temporary fixes begin to replace real growth. When growth slows and behavior shifts toward preservation, pressure builds for solutions that promise results without disruption. This is the phase where easy solutions enter the picture, not because they're foolish, but because they are politically convenient, emotionally reassuring, and temporarily effective. These solutions don't announce themselves as shortcuts. They are framed as pragmatic tools to smooth cycles, protect livelihoods, and buy time. And for a while, they work well enough to delay hard decisions. Easy solutions usually take familiar forms. Monetary easing becomes more aggressive. Interest rates stay low for longer. Credit expands to compensate for stagnant wages and weak investment. Governments increase spending to support demand, often without addressing underlying inefficiencies. None of this is inherently reckless. In fact, many of these tools are essential during genuine crises. The problem arises when they become substitutes for structural change rather than bridges toward it. Over time, the economy adapts to these tools in subtle but important ways. Businesses begin to rely on cheap financing instead of productivity gains. Investors chase returns in assets inflated by liquidity rather than value created by innovation. Governments grow comfortable managing demand instead of improving supply. The system becomes dependent on support, even as that support delivers diminishing returns. Growth continues, but it is increasingly artificial, sustained by policy rather than performance. What makes this phase especially dangerous is how normal it feels. There is no obvious line where support turns into dependence. Each intervention is justified by the conditions of the moment. Low interest rates are extended because growth is weak. Growth remains weak because incentives to innovate are distorted. To counter that weakness, support is expanded again. The cycle feeds itself, not through conspiracy or incompetence, but through reasonable decisions responding to short-term pressures. Meanwhile, the cost of these easy solutions accumulates quietly. Debt rises. Asset prices detach further from underlying economic activity. Inequality widens as those who own assets benefit more than those who rely on income. Yet because the system avoids immediate collapse, these costs are tolerated. Stability is preserved, headlines remain calm, and the illusion of control persists. The real danger is not that easy solutions fail immediately, but that they succeed too well in postponing reality. By the time their limits become obvious, the economy has lost resilience. Policy space is narrower, public tolerance for adjustment is lower, and the changes required to restore growth are far more disruptive than they would have been earlier. If you're finding this analysis useful, take a moment to subscribe and share this video with someone who enjoys understanding how economic systems actually function. And if you haven't already, check out our previous discussion on how success changes behavior. It explains why these solutions become so tempting in the first place. Because as temporary fixes turn into permanent features, deeper structural weaknesses begin to take root. And that's when recovery becomes truly difficult. By the time easy solutions become permanent, the economy has already crossed an important threshold. The problem is no longer cyclical or temporary, it is structural. This is the stage where weaknesses stop being side effects and start becoming features of the system itself. And once that happens, reversing course is no longer a matter of adjusting policy levers. It requires changing incentives, expectations, and power structures that have been building for years. Structural weakness often begins with misallocation. Capital flows not to where it is most productive, but to where it feels safest or most protected. Industries that should naturally shrink are kept alive through subsidies, favorable regulation, or cheap credit. Meanwhile, emerging sectors struggle to access funding because they are riskier and politically untested. Over time, this creates an economy that looks busy but produces less real value. Resources are tied up maintaining the past instead of building the future. Productivity suffers as a result. When inefficient firms survive and competitive pressure weakens, there's little incentive to improve. Innovation slows, not because talent disappears, but because the system no longer rewards it adequately. Talented individuals gravitate towards sectors that extract value, finance, real estate, regulatory arbitrage, rather than those that create it. This shift further reinforces stagnation, even as headline indicators remain stable. Labor markets reflect this structural drift. Jobs exist, but many are lower quality, less secure, or less productive than before. Wage growth remains weak, forcing households to rely on debt, asset appreciation, or government support to maintain living standards. Social mobility declines not suddenly, but steadily. The economy still functions, but it no longer feels like it's working for everyone, and that perception matters. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of structural weakness is how it narrows future choices. As dependency on certain industries, policies, or financial conditions grows, changing them becomes politically and economically costly. Reform threatens existing livelihoods, asset values, and institutions. Even when leaders recognize the problem, they face resistance from groups that benefit from the status quo. The longer this phase lasts, the harder reform becomes. At this point, recovery is still possible, but it requires courage, coordination, and a willingness to accept short-term pain for long-term gain. Unfortunately, most systems delay that choice until they are forced to make it. And when reform is postponed long enough, the cost of inaction compounds quietly, locking the economy into a path that is far harder to escape. If this kind of long-term perspective helps you see economic stories more clearly, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. And don't miss our earlier video on easy solutions. It explains how well-intentioned fixes can create lasting damage. Because even as structural weakness deepens, it still doesn't feel like a crisis. And that false calm is what allows stagnation to become the new normal. Even after structural weakness has taken root, most people still wouldn't describe the situation as a crisis. That's because crises are loud. They come with panic, headlines, and visible breakdowns. What's happening here is the opposite. The economy is functioning, just not progressing. Shops are open, salaries are paid, markets move, and governments reassure the public that conditions are challenging but manageable. This normalcy is precisely what makes stagnation so powerful and so difficult to confront. One reason it doesn't feel like a crisis is adaptation. People adjust expectations gradually. When growth slows, the first response isn't outrage, it's recalibration. Young people delay milestones, households accept higher debt, workers settle for less security, businesses lower long-term ambitions. Each adjustment feels reasonable on its own. Collectively, they represent a quiet downgrade of the future. Because the change is incremental, it rarely triggers a sense of emergency. Markets contribute to this illusion as well. Asset prices can remain high, or even rise, during periods of weak underlying growth, especially when liquidity is abundant and alternatives are limited. This creates a confusing signal. If markets are stable, the logic goes, the economy must be fine. But markets increasingly reflect financial conditions rather than productive strength. They measure confidence in policy support, not confidence in growth itself. Governments also play a role in maintaining calm. Their legitimacy often depends on avoiding visible disruption. As long as unemployment doesn't spike and inflation stays contained, the situation is framed as under control. Language matters here. Terms like transition, rebalancing, or new normal replace words like stagnation or decline. The narrative becomes one of patience rather than urgency. Socially, this phase produces frustration without focus. People feel pressure, but they struggle to identify a clear cause. There is no single policy to blame, no obvious villain to oppose. Discontent builds slowly, often expressing itself through polarization, mistrust, or disengagement rather than organized demand for reform. The system absorbs dissatisfaction without changing direction. This is the most dangerous moment in the entire cycle, not because collapse is imminent, but because complacency is strongest. When an economy no longer grows yet still feels stable, the motivation to act disappears, and without action, the forces pulling the system downward continue unchecked. If this analysis is helping you see why stagnation is so hard to recognize, subscribe and share this video with someone who enjoys deeper economic stories. And be sure to watch our earlier breakdown on structural weakness. It explains how economies reach this deceptive calm. Because the longer stagnation feels normal, the closer the economy moves to a point where easy recovery is no longer possible, and turning back becomes far more painful than anyone expected. There comes a stage where the economy still looks stable on the surface, but the range of viable choices has narrowed dramatically. This is the point of no easy return, not because collapse is guaranteed, but because every remaining option carries visible costs. Earlier in the cycle, leaders could delay, smooth, and manage problems quietly. Now, each decision involves trade-offs that someone will feel immediately, and that is exactly why action becomes so difficult. At this stage, policy tools lose their flexibility. Interest rates are already low, debt levels are high, and public trust in institutions is thinner than before. Measures that once stimulated growth now produce weaker effects. More spending delivers less momentum. More credit inflates assets rather than productivity. The system still responds, but sluggishly and often in unintended ways. What used to be a steering wheel begins to feel like a brake pedal. The private sector feels this constraint as well. Businesses that adapted to years of cheap financing struggle in an environment where support is questioned. Firms that survived through protection or consolidation resist competition. Innovation becomes harder because the cost of failure is higher and tolerance for experimentation is lower. The economy's ability to reinvent itself, once its greatest strength, has been gradually eroded. Social dynamics intensify the problem. By now, large parts of the population are dependent on the existing structure, even if it no longer delivers growth. Asset owners fear correction. Workers fear disruption. Governments fear backlash. Any reform that promises long-term benefits threatens short-term stability, and stability has become the system's primary objective. The result is paralysis. Everyone agrees something must change, but no one agrees on who should bear the cost. This is also the point where external shocks become far more dangerous. In a flexible, growing economy, shocks are absorbed and adjusted to. In a stagnant, fragile one, the same shocks expose weaknesses that were previously hidden. What could have been managed earlier now risks cascading effects. Not because the shock itself is unprecedented, but because the system no longer has slack. The tragedy of this phase is that the economy is not beyond saving, but saving it now requires honesty and sacrifice. It requires acknowledging limits, reallocating resources, and accepting disruption that was postponed for years. These are difficult choices, and they become harder the longer they are delayed. The cost of adjustment rises quietly, just like the stagnation that preceded it. If you're finding value in this long-form breakdown, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who enjoys understanding how economies really change over time. And don't miss our earlier discussion on why stagnation feels normal. It explains how economies drift into this corner without realizing it. Because once easy options disappear, the consequences of delay become permanent, and the economy enters a phase where time itself works against recovery. When an economy reaches this stage, decline no longer looks like a dramatic fall. It feels slow, uneven, and confusing. There are good years and bad years, moments of optimism followed by disappointment. From the outside, it can even look like resilience. But underneath, the long-term consequences of stalled growth are steadily reshaping society, opportunity, and expectations in ways that are difficult to reverse. One of the most lasting consequences is stagnation disguised as stability. Economic output grows, but barely faster than population. Productivity improvements are marginal. Living standards inch forward, if at all. For many people, life becomes a constant exercise in maintenance rather than advancement. They are not collapsing into poverty, but they are no longer moving meaningfully ahead. Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful sense that the future has shrunk. Generational divides widen in this environment. Those who accumulated assets during earlier growth phases benefit from rising or protected values. Those who enter later face higher barriers, expensive housing, slower wage growth, and fewer opportunities to build wealth. This isn't just an economic issue. It becomes a social one. Trust in institutions erodes as younger generations feel the system worked for others but not for them. That erosion doesn't happen overnight. It accumulates quietly. Innovation also changes character. Instead of bold economy-wide breakthroughs, progress becomes narrow and uneven. Advances may occur in specific sectors or technologies, but they fail to translate into broad-based growth. The economy becomes more fragmented. Pockets of prosperity coexist with widespread stagnation. This fragmentation makes it harder to build consensus around reform because experiences differ so sharply across groups. Politically, long-term stagnation creates volatility. When growth can no longer absorb conflict, disagreements become zero-sum. Every policy choice feels like redistribution rather than expansion. This fuels polarization and short-term thinking, further weakening the ability to plan for the future. The system becomes reactive, constantly responding to pressure without addressing root causes. Perhaps the most damaging consequence is psychological. When people stop believing that effort leads to progress, behavior changes, risk-taking declines, ambition narrows. Societies become more cautious, more defensive, and less open to change. This mindset feeds back into the economy, reinforcing the very stagnation that created it. If this perspective resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts below. It helps keep these long-form discussions alive. And if you haven't already, watch our earlier video on the point of no easy return. It explains how economies arrive at this slow-motion outcome. Because as these consequences compound over time, a deeper question emerges. Why do so many different economies across history fall into the same pattern again and again? When you step back and look across different countries, time periods, and economic systems, one fact becomes hard to ignore. This pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. The details change: technology, politics, culture. But the structure remains the same. Growth accelerates, success builds confidence, stability becomes the priority, and adaptation slows. Eventually, stagnation sets in. This repetition is not a coincidence, nor is it the result of collective ignorance. It happens because the forces that drive early growth are very different from the forces required to sustain it. In the early stages of development or expansion, incentives are aligned toward progress. There is room to grow, gaps to close, and obvious improvements to make. Productivity gains are relatively easy. Political coalitions favor change because the benefits are visible and broadly shared. But as economies mature, the source of growth shifts. It no longer comes from catching up. It must come from reinventing. And reinvention is inherently disruptive. It creates winners and losers in real time, rather than promising shared gains in the future. This is where resistance forms. Groups that benefited from the old model gain influence and seek to protect their position. Institutions designed to stabilize growth become obstacles to transformation. Policies meant to reduce risk start to suppress experimentation. None of this requires bad intent. It is the natural outcome of systems built to preserve success rather than challenge it. Over time, the economy becomes optimized for continuity, not renewal. Another reason history repeats this pattern is political time horizons. Structural reform rarely pays off quickly. Its benefits often appear years later, sometimes under a different government. The costs, however, are immediate and visible. Leaders who push deep reforms risk backlash long before results arrive. As a result, even when the need for change is understood, delay feels safer than action. The system drifts not because solutions are unknown, but because they are inconvenient. There is also a psychological element. Success breeds narratives of exceptionalism, the belief that this time is different. Past collapses are treated as lessons for others, not warnings for ourselves. Each generation assumes it can manage risks better, design smarter policies, and exit before consequences appear. This confidence delays recognition of danger until options are limited. Understanding this repetition is not about assigning blame. It's about recognizing constraints. Economies don't fail because people stop trying. They fail because the conditions that once rewarded progress gradually reward preservation instead. And unless that incentive structure changes, history will keep repeating itself. If you value this kind of long-term pattern-based analysis, consider subscribing and sharing this video. And don't forget to watch our earlier deep dive on long-term economic consequences. It shows how repetition turns into stagnation. Because once we understand why this pattern keeps returning, the final question becomes unavoidable. What actually stops an economy from growing, and can it ever truly start again? At the deepest level, economic growth doesn't stop because of a single shock, bad leader, or unlucky moment. It stops when an economy loses its ability to change itself. Growth is not just expansion, it is adaptation. It comes from reallocating resources, replacing outdated systems, and allowing new ideas to challenge old advantages. When that process slows or becomes politically, financially, or socially blocked, growth fades even if the economy appears stable on the surface. What truly stops growth is rigidity. Institutions become harder to reform, capital becomes harder to redirect, labor becomes harder to retrain, policies become harder to reverse. Over time, the system favors those who benefit from the current structure rather than those who could build the next one. This doesn't feel like failure, it feels like protection. But protection, when overused, turns into stagnation. Restarting growth is possible, but it never looks like the past. Economies that recover don't simply restore old momentum. They undergo uncomfortable transitions. They accept short-term disruption in exchange for long-term capacity. That usually means allowing inefficient firms to fail, redirecting capital toward productivity rather than assets, investing in skills rather than subsidies, and tolerating uncertainty long enough for innovation to emerge. None of these steps are popular. All of them face resistance. That's why recovery is rare and delay is common. Perhaps the most important requirement for renewed growth is honesty. Honest recognition that stability without progress is decline in slow motion. Honest acknowledgement that past success does not guarantee future relevance. And honest communication with the public about trade-offs, because sustainable growth cannot be engineered quietly. It requires collective agreement that change is worth the discomfort it brings. This is why the moment an economy stops growing is so hard to identify. It doesn't announce itself as a crisis. It hides behind normalcy, routine, and reassurance. By the time stagnation is undeniable, the choices available are narrower and the costs higher. That doesn't mean recovery is impossible, but it does mean it demands far more than technical fixes. It demands a shift in priorities, incentives, and expectations. This video is the foundation of this channel. Here, we don't just explain what happened. We explain why patterns repeat, why systems resist change, and why the most dangerous economic moments rarely look dangerous at all. If you value long-form documentary-style explanations that go beyond headlines, consider subscribing, sharing your perspective in the comments, and staying with us as we break down how economies really rise, stall, and transform. Tomorrow, we'll continue this conversation by exploring how easy money quietly reshapes an economy over time, and why it almost always backfires when growth slows.